The eyes of my fellow soldiers were as sharp as bullets, aimed straight at me. Matthew Miller, a gay sergeant, because I was convicted of killing 3 civilians during a military campaign. I had resigned myself to my fate, already imagining the moment I would sit in the electric chair. My once proud eyes now held only a dark emptiness, like New York's gloomy evening sky. For the first time in weeks, I stood tall and spoke. I have one final request. My voice, though steady, was weighted with emotion, coming just before my sentence would be carried out. I want to see my partner, Jack, one last time. The mention of his name sent a murmur rippling through the room. Jack wasn't just a dog. He was my K9 partner, a German shepherd who had served alongside me in countless perilous missions abroad. Our bond was legendary, built on loyalty and survival. The judge, visibly taken aback, adjusted his glasses and hesitated. Sergeant Carter, this court has never had a precedent for this sort of thing. I'm not sure it can be done. Before he could finish, Captain Grace Wilson, a former colleague, rose from the back of the room. Your Honor, she said firmly, Jack is also a veteran. He risked his life for this country, just like Matthew did. Denying this request would be inhumane. A heavy tension settled in the courtroom as the judge considered her words. After a moment, he sighed and finally relented, though with clear reluctance. The court grants this request under strict supervision. You have 10 minutes with the dog. The decision sent a quiet ripple of whispers through the crowd. Still in handcuffs, I closed my eyes and exhaled deeply. I didn't know what to expect from this reunion, but I knew I needed to say goodbye to the one who had never judged me. When I was led into a private room, each step felt heavier than the last. Then I heard the scratching of paws on the floor, the faint jingle of a collar. The door opened, and there he was, Jack. He moved without hesitation, his every step filled with purpose and resolve, placing his front paws on my chest. Me, a gay soldier who had endured explosions, bullets, and the horrors of war. I wept as I held Jack's face in my hands. You never gave up on me, did you? I whispered, my voice breaking. Jack whimpered softly, pressing his muzzle against my cheek as though sensing the weight of my pain. In that instant, something changed within me. A buried, forgotten memory began surfacing. A detail from that night took shape, reinforcing something I hadn't realized before, something that might prove my innocence. I sat on a cold metal chair, my hands trembling as I stroked Jack's thick fur. His presence granted me a rare moment of calm in my storm of despair. Yet my mind was racing, haunted by that faint recollection. Flashes of the ambush flooded back. The mission had gone disastrously wrong, and I was blamed for it all. I closed my eyes and clutched Jack's collar, trying to recall the images of that chaotic night. Gunfire, my team shouting, the metallic smell of blood in the air, all of it as vivid as if it had happened just yesterday. Then came a voice I hadn't remembered before, shouting something incoherent at the time. It was a setup. My heart pounded, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. Someone on my team had deliberately supplied the wrong coordinates. I hadn't pieced it together until now, but the details aligned too perfectly to ignore. Someone had lured us into that trap, knowing civilians would be caught in the crossfire. But who and why? I gasped, staring at Jack. He gazed back at me with his steady, familiar eyes, as if willing me to focus. Before I could gather myself, the guard at the door cleared his throat. 5 minutes left, he announced tersely, breaking my fragile moment of clarity. My chest tightened. 5 minutes wasn't nearly enough to process what I'd just realized, let alone say goodbye to Jack or figure out how to prove my innocence. Yet, as Jack pressed closer, I recognized something crucial. He might hold the key. Jack had been there that night. He was a trained military K9 and wore a camera on his vest, capturing every second of the mission. Jack, I whispered, my voice trembling but determined. If the footage still existed, it might show what really happened that night, prove I hadn't fired the fatal shots. But retrieving it wouldn't be easy. Jack had been reassigned following the trial, and any evidence from that night would be locked away deep in military archives. "You might be the only one who can save me," I said, voice cracking. Jack barked softly, his ears perked, as though sensing the urgency of the moment. The door abruptly swung open, and 2 soldiers stepped inside. "Time's up," one stated flatly. My stomach clenched, but I knew resistance was futile. As they came for Jack, I pressed my forehead to his and closed my eyes. "I'll find a way," I whispered. "I promise." The guards pulled Jack away. He resisted with soft whines, glancing back at me as the door shut, leaving me alone in that cold, desolate room. A spark of determination flared within my chest. I didn't know how, but I would get that footage. I had no other option. Back in my cell, the walls felt as though they were closing in, the faint flicker of the overhead light casting long shadows on the cement floor. Yet I barely noticed them. My mind was consumed by a single thought: the footage from Jack's vest. If it still existed, it would be buried deep within military records, locked behind layers of classified documents. A long shot, maybe impossible, but all I had left. Sitting on my bunk's edge, I stared at faded scratches on the walls, the desperate marks I'd made to count the days since my conviction. Never had it been clearer how quickly my time was running out. My thoughts turned to Captain Grace Wilson, the only person I could trust. Grace had been a loyal colleague, one of the few who hadn't turned against me. She'd defended me in court, vouching for my character when no one else would. If anyone could dig into those archives and find that footage, it was her. But how could I reach her? Death row inmates don't get free rein with a telephone, and every word I spoke was monitored. Still, I had to try. That afternoon, I was in the visitation room, waiting for the guard to bring me a phone. I'd convinced them I needed one last call, one of the final privileges afforded to the condemned. When the phone was placed in front of me, I wasted no time dialing Grace's number. It rang twice before I heard her familiar voice. "Hello?" she said warily, papers rustling in the background. I tightened my grip on the receiver. "Grace, it's me, Matthew." She paused, then took a shaky breath. "Matthew, how are you even calling me?" she asked, sounding shocked and anxious. "No time to explain," I answered quickly, lowering my voice. "Listen to me. Jack's camera from that night. Do you think it still exists?" The footage could prove I didn't fire those shots. Silence. My heart pounded as I waited. Finally, she replied, "I don't know, Matthew. After the trial, a lot of evidence got classified or destroyed. But if it's anywhere, it'll be in the base's secure evidence vault." My pulse raced. "Grace, please. You're the only one I trust. If there's any chance it's still there, I need you to find it." She hesitated. Then her voice hardened with resolve. "All right, I'll look. But Matthew, this won't be easy. If they find out what I'm doing, my career is over. You understand?" Guilt and gratitude welled up in me. "I do, Grace. I wouldn't ask if I had another choice." Before she could respond, the guard motioned for me to hang up. "I have to go," I said hurriedly. "Thank you. And be careful." As I was led back to my cell, the smallest spark of hope flickered in my chest. For the first time in months, I let myself believe there might be a way out of this nightmare. Night fell as Grace walked the dim corridors of the military base, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been stationed here for years, but tonight, those once familiar hallways felt like enemy territory. Each step echoed louder than the one before. Every shadow seemed to harbor watchful eyes. She clutched her keycard, knowing one misstep could end not just her career, but also land her in prison. Memories of Matthew's desperate, determined voice on the phone spurred her on. She couldn't back down now. The evidence vault was in a high-security section of the base, behind multiple locked doors and cameras. She'd planned carefully, timing her approach to avoid patrols. She swiped her keycard at the first checkpoint, holding her breath as the scanner processed. A green light flashed and the door slid open. So far, so good. Inside, a cold, metallic smell filled the air. Rows of storage lockers extended before her, each containing classified relics from forgotten missions. Somewhere in there was the footage from Jack's vest. Moving swiftly, she scanned labels, eyes darting from one code name to the next, searching for records of that ill-fated mission. When she finally spotted it, Operation Dawnstrike, her breath caught. She pulled open the drawer, sifting through files, photos, and, at last, a small dust-covered hard drive. Lifting it gently, her hands trembled. This tiny device might hold the truth Matthew needed. Just then, footsteps approached outside. A flashlight beam swept across the vault door. Grace's heart thundered as she pressed herself against the wall. The voices of two guards grew louder. "I thought I heard something," one said. Grace held her breath, mind racing. If they found her now, she'd have no explanation. She spotted a maintenance hatch on the far side of the vault. Carefully, she slipped across the floor, boots barely making a sound. She opened the hatch just as the vault door slid. Sliding into the narrow passage, Grace pulled the hatch closed behind her, heart pounding so loud it filled her ears. She emerged into the cool night air outside, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Though the hard drive was safe, the danger was far from over. Decrypting the footage would be a battle of its own. As she hurried to her car, the gravity of what she'd done pressed down on her. She'd crossed a line tonight. There was no turning back. Grace parked in a deserted lot miles from the base. Her laptop screen cast a pale glow over her face as she connected the hard drive. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard in momentary hesitation. If the drive held nothing, everything she'd risked would be wasted. Taking a steadying breath, she clicked on the first file. The screen flickered, and a grainy video began. Jack's point of view. The camera captured the chaos of that night. Gunfire crackled through the speakers, making her jump. Matthew's squad advanced through a crumbling building, their voices urgent, but controlled. She watched Jack's sleek body poised low to the ground, scanning for threats. Suddenly, a civilian in plainclothes entered the frame, and the screen exploded with shouting. Matthew's voice rose above the rest. "Civilians, hold your fire!" Grace's heart sank as the scene unfolded. Gunshots rang out, but they didn't come from Matthew. The camera angle shifted, revealing a figure raising his weapon and firing point blank at the civilians. Grace froze the video, dread twisting in her stomach. Rewinding, she focused on the shooter. The footage was fuzzy, but the uniform outline was unmistakably that of someone on Matthew's own team. Her hand clenched. Matthew had been telling the truth. He hadn't fired the fatal shots. He'd been framed. But by whom and why? Staring at the screen, her mind spun. She needed a clearer look at the shooter's face to expose the truth. Yet any attempt to enhance the footage could tip off the wrong people. Her phone suddenly vibrated on the passenger seat. She picked up, careful. "Hello?" "Captain Wilson," a low, stern voice answered. "This is Colonel Briggs. I need to see you immediately." Grace felt a chill. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, forcing an even tone. "We've had reports of unauthorized activity in the evidence vault," Briggs snapped. "My office, 700, non-negotiable." He hung up before she could respond. Her grip tightened on the wheel. They were closing in. She'd run out of time and still hadn't told Matthew what she'd found. She had to act quickly, but she couldn't do it alone. Her only option was to entrust the footage to someone outside the military, someone who could release it publicly. As she stared at Jack's frozen image on the screen, one thought crystallized. This wasn't just about saving Matthew anymore. It was about exposing a betrayal hidden deep in the system. Early the next morning, Grace pulled into a small diner on the outskirts of town. The sun was just rising, and the only other customer was a trucker sipping coffee by the window. She gripped the hard drive as she entered, scanning the room until she spotted the one person she trusted, Ryan Martin, a former investigative reporter discharged for digging too deeply into corruption. He looked up, surprise and wariness flickering across his face. "Grace," he said, setting down his mug. "You're the last person I expected to hear from." She slid into the booth, placing the hard drive on the table. "I need your help," she said plainly. "This drive has footage that proves Matthew Miller didn't kill those civilians. But if I go through official channels, it'll get buried like everything else." Ryan leaned back, brows raised. "You realize what you're asking? If it's as explosive as you say, the people covering it up won't hesitate to silence us. For good." She swallowed hard. "I don't have a choice. Matthew has days left, maybe less. This is his only shot." Ryan studied her face for a long moment, then leaned in, lowering his voice. "All right. If we're doing this, we have to move fast. I know someone who can enhance the footage and push it to the right outlets, but we'll need to dodge the military's firewalls, or they'll just claim it's been doctored." Grace set her jaw. "Then let's get started." They drove to a safe house Ryan maintained, an old, dingy apartment on the edge of the city. Dark curtains covered the windows. Inside, Ryan fired up his equipment, multiple monitors, encrypted connections, and an arsenal of tools Grace couldn't begin to understand. As the footage played again and again, the blurry image of the shooter haunted her. Finally, Ryan froze it, zoomed in, and sharpened the shot just enough to see the man's face. Grace stifled a gasp. It was Lieutenant Greg Aaron, someone both she and Matthew had served with. "It's him," she whispered, voice shaking. "He set Matthew up." Ryan nodded grimly. "If he's involved, you can bet there are others protecting him. This is bigger than one person." Grace's mind raced. Aaron had power, connections, resources, enough to bury them both if he realized they knew. But for Matthew, she couldn't back down. Her hands trembled at the image on the screen. Lieutenant Aaron, caught mid-frame, betrayed them all. She'd once trusted him. Now the truth left a bitter taste in her mouth, but there was no time for anger. "We can't stay here," Ryan said, grabbing his jacket. "If Aaron's circle finds out what we've uncovered, they'll come after us." Grace tucked the hard drive into her pocket. Time was running out, and Matthew's life hung in the balance. They split up. Ryan would contact a tech expert to hack the original mission logs before the military could dismiss the footage as fake. Meanwhile, Grace would seek out a high-ranking officer she believed uncorrupted, someone who might make the evidence count. It was risky, but it was all they had. "Be careful," Ryan said as they parted in the alley. "We're playing a dangerous game." Grace nodded, determination etched on her face. "I'll be in touch." Grace navigated through the city outskirts, mind churning over the possibilities. She needed someone with unshakable integrity. General Marcus Ellison came to mind, a decorated officer known for zero tolerance toward corruption. She'd met him once years ago and remembered him as unwavering in his patriotism. Pulling into a secure installation, she took a steadying breath and presented her ID. "I need to see General Ellison," she told the guard. "It's a life or death matter." After a tense wait, she was escorted into a small office where the general sat behind a desk stacked with reports and medals. He looked up, brow furrowed, until he recognized her. "Captain Wilson," he said, gesturing for her to sit. What brings you here in such unusual circumstances? Grace wasted no words. She produced the hard drive and set it before him. Sir, this proves Sergeant Matthew Miller's innocence and implicates Lieutenant Aaron in the deaths of 3 civilians. I need your help getting it where it can't be buried. His expression darkened. If this is true, it's not just a matter for the police. It's a cover-up. He exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the drive. You know the risks you're taking? Grace looked him in the eye, voice unwavering. Yes, sir. But I'd rather risk everything than watch an innocent man die for what he didn't do. Ellison studied her for a moment, then nodded. Give it to me. I'll verify it and do what I can. Relief washed over her. Yet as she left his office, a cold thought struck. If Ellison wasn't trustworthy, it would all be for nothing. I sat on my bunk, staring at the wall as hours passed in silence. Only the faint hum of the fluorescent light cut through the stillness. My mind spun with doubts. Had Grace found anything? Was all of this in vain? My heart ached at the thought of Jack, my last real link to the life I once had. I clenched my fists, trying to hold onto the sliver of hope Grace had ignited. But as the clock ticked down to my execution, hope felt like sand slipping through my fingers. Grace sat outside the base in her car, stomach knotted. She'd heard nothing from Ellison since giving him the hard drive. Should she go back? He had told her to wait. Her phone rang, abruptly slicing through the tension. She expected Ellison, but froze at the sound of Lieutenant Aaron's voice. Captain Wilson, he said. Calm. I hear you've been busy. Her blood ran cold. What do you want, Aaron? She snapped. He gave a dark chuckle. I want you to stop before you dig yourself in any deeper. He hung up before she could respond, leaving her gasping. Aaron knew. Worse, he sounded confident, like he was pulling strings to destroy her. Heart pounding, Grace started the engine and raced toward the base, intending to warn Ellison. But upon arrival, she saw 2 unmarked SUVs and men in suits. They weren't Ellison's people. Her stomach lurched. They were here for him, or for the evidence. Instinct screamed at her to leave, so she spun the wheel and sped away. She immediately called Ryan. Aaron knows everything, she said as soon as he picked up. We have to move now. Ellison might be compromised. Ryan swore under his breath. We'll blow it wide open then. Meet me at the safe house. If they're this desperate, that means the footage is real. We need to get it public before they bury us. Grace's heart pounded. Time was almost up. The stakes were higher than ever. While driving, she glanced at her rearview mirror and saw headlights trailing her at a distance. Her pulse raced. This was no longer just about saving Matthew. It was also about staying alive to expose the truth. She made sudden turns, cutting through side streets in a desperate bid to lose them. Her knuckles whitened around the wheel. For a moment, the lights vanished, and she exhaled shakily, but they soon reappeared, closer this time. Whoever they were, they wouldn't give up. She floored the accelerator, weaving through the city until spotting an abandoned industrial lot. Without hesitation, she swung in, gravel crunching beneath her tires. Killing the engine, she scrambled out, clutching the hard drive to her chest. She took cover behind a rusted shipping container, listening as the pursuing vehicle rolled in and stopped. Doors slammed, heavy footsteps grew louder. Her heart thudded as she crouched low, every muscle taut. A voice barked orders, cold and commanding. Through a gap in the container, Grace saw 3 men in dark suits, each armed. One swept a flashlight across the lot. Her breath caught. She had to escape, but they were too close. Just then, a clang echoed from the far side of the yard. One man spun around. Over there, he hissed, signaling the others. Grace didn't know what caused the noise, but she seized the opportunity. As they moved away, She bolted toward the lot's edge, staying low and darting between leftover machinery. Her lungs burned, but she kept running until she reached the fence line and slipped through a gap onto a deserted street. Her car was gone, probably taken by the men, but she didn't care. Sprinting until she found a tiny gas station, she pulled out her phone. Ryan answered on the first ring. "Where are you?" he asked urgently. "I'm not sure," she admitted breathlessly. "They found me. I barely escaped." Ryan's tone darkened. "You have to keep moving. Meet me at the old train station on the west side of town. It's isolated. We'll figure out our next move there." "I'll be there," she said, hanging up. As she walked, her body still shook from the chase. She realized just how dangerous this had become. Aaron and his men weren't just trying to hide the truth, they were hunting her. She clutched the hard drive, vowing silently to protect it. Matthew's life, and now hers, depended on it. The abandoned train station was eerily still, cast in the faint orange glow of distant streetlights. Grace slipped through a shattered doorway, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Ryan was there, hunched over a laptop perched on a wooden crate. His face was lit by the screen, etched with the strain of focus and fatigue. "You made it," he said, relief plain in his voice. Grace nodded and placed the hard drive beside him. "Just barely," she replied, her tone taut. "They're on our heels, Ryan. We don't have much time." Ryan plugged in the drive and began typing furiously. The footage and enhanced images of Aaron filled the screen. "Here he is," Ryan said, glancing at her. "We send this everywhere. News outlets, whistleblower sites. Once it's public, they can't bury it." Grace's hands shook. "Are you sure that'll be enough?" Ryan locked eyes with her. "Once the world sees this, Aaron can't hide. And if Ellison's still on our side, he can force the military to act." She took a long breath and nodded. "Do it." Ryan hit a key, and the files started uploading. Every second crawled as the progress bar crept forward. At 95%, screeching tires outside shattered the silence. Fear clenched Grace's chest. "They found us," she whispered. Ryan cursed, pulling a handgun from his bag. "Keep them off the laptop," he said, moving toward the entrance. Grace stood by the crate, gripping a rusty wrench, her heart hammering. A man in dark clothing appeared in the doorway. The next seconds burst into shouts and chaos. One of Aaron's men took aim, but Ryan fired first, forcing him into cover. Another man fired back, his shot ricocheting off the metal beams overhead. The laptop chimed, a triumphant beep. "Done," Ryan yelled, but his relief was cut short as a third assailant rushed in. They struggled, and Ryan's gun clattered away. Grace lurched forward, swinging the wrench with all her might. The attacker collapsed, and Ryan staggered to his feet as sirens wailed nearby. Exchanging a glance of wearied relief, they knew help was closing in, and the footage had been broadcast, revealing Aaron's guilt and proving my innocence. A few days later, my conviction was overturned and Aaron was arrested, though the damage from his betrayal would leave deep scars for years. In the quiet aftermath, Grace stood outside the prison gates as I walked free under the bright sunlight. Jack bounded toward me, and I knelt to bury my face in his fur. "I told you I'd figure it out," I murmured. Grace knew we had all fought for this moment, and she believed that in the end, truth would always triumph over deceit.